I've tried hard to stay away from being a collector of video games. I don't actually own an obscene number of physical games and don't get the same kind of rush from completing a certain collection as I know so many others do. My focus has always been on the experience that each individual game can provide someone and how priceless this can be in the right circumstances. It's no secret to anybody that collecting any game that is worth collecting comes down to one simple factor, and it has an awful lot to do with... and I'd rather just talk about them. Rare games are an interesting prospect to ponder on, and while I don't personally own anything that is worth any substantial amount of money, I do appreciate that people have preserved these games and really elevated them above where they started life. Imagine working on a game where one copy would one day be worth more than your entire wage. Kinda puts things into perspective, doesn't it? So what typically separates a standard game from some of the rarest ever made? Well, usually they have to be made any time after 1985, with a particular style of humour about them that often shows influence from the company's English roots, before it was eventually butchered and sold off to Microsoft in 2002, and that is a joke that I stole from Twitter and I'm not ashamed of it. Real talk though, I don't really know. There isn't one single through line other than a game seeing a limited release for whatever reason and collectors spending a lot of money to obtain such a lucrative chunk of game. Maybe we'll find out as we go. It's always been my favourite style of making a video. Why stop now? If you're looking to rare video games for any amount of time, you'll quickly come to realise that the vast majority of the really valuable titles out there are old. It'll be interesting how this progresses decades down the line, since we both have a greater appreciation of preserving all this media nowadays, while also continuing to persist with online stores, digital downloads, and other temporary measures that are ultimately lost to the ravages of time. When I think of rare video games, I don't specifically think of older, super obscure titles hidden away in a box at the bottom of someone's garden, but I do think of the Nintendo World Championship cartridges and how very special circumstances can create a unique part of gaming history that does indeed sell for a ton of money. You remember a few years ago when Nintendo decided to hold a small tournament to pit about a dozen players against each other in a series of Nintendo games to determine who is the most Nintendo of them all? Yeah, the thing that convinced a lot of people that Mario Maker would be worth the money. I think Eageraptor was there, and Reggie wasn't great at Smash Bros as well. I remember that. Well, 25 years prior, Nintendo held a very similar kind of tournament, just without the internet personalities and the modern video games and the live streaming. And rather than getting Shigeru Miyamoto to hand out a fancy trophy, the 90 finalists at the 1990 tournament were given custom NES cartridges that contained the mini-games that made up the finals. These are pretty rare and would definitely set you back quite a lot of cash, but Nintendo Power ran a contest where another 26 winners were given cartridges with the same kind of stuff on it, but they were gold! These are rarer and way more expensive. Anyone else feel poor yet? We're just getting started. Statistically, the championship cartridges don't really hold a candle to some of the rarest games on the market today, but they are by far and away the most popular rare games out there, if you know what I mean by that. I was thinking, what's the modern day equivalent of them? Because like Golden Switch cartridges, it's not quite as impressive, it's less gold, you know? Would it make for the same kind of reward? Maybe it'll make them taste better. I have troubling news to report. I've been getting really into Battle Royale games recently. I guess this is always going to happen, and the only thing stopping me from doing so sooner was all this overexposure that practically demanded that I get on board with all this Fortnite stuff. Mind you, I still haven't, because Apex Legends is a thing that I enjoy playing, and Nintendo decided to dump Tetris 99 out of nowhere on spectators who were expecting Animal Crossing or Pokemon, but ended up with something way better! Even in 2019, you can't avoid Tetris, and when it's as solid a game as this, why would you ever want to? Get it while it's hot, because you never know when it might become incredibly rare all of a sudden. Fucking Tetris. The joke has always been that Tetris is available on every single console ever made, even ones that haven't even been made yet. Work that one out. But Fundamentally, Tetris has very rarely been altered. Some of these games are better than others, and some of them are rarer than others. There's only about 10 copies of Tetris for the Sega Genesis out there, and it really should be less than that. So, bootlegs, eh? Yeah, I bet you were wondering if I was going to mention bootlegs and how complicated it makes things when you consider how rare a game can be when it shouldn't exist at all. In the late 80s and early 90s, Nintendo had a complete license monopoly on Tetris, stating that the hit puzzle game could only be made for Nintendo consoles. Tetris still made its way to other devices though, most notably when it ended up on the Sega Genesis despite the many licensing hurdles that it failed to overcome. As a result, only 10 copies of this version of Tetris were ever made, and that tends to do a lot for how much people are willing to pay for the privilege. In 2011, one copy was sold for $1 million, somewhat aided by series creator Alexei Payetnov's signature adorning the outside. It looks like regular Tetris though, which is something you can get for free these days with the added bonus of online multiplayer against 98 other players. So maybe look somewhere else if that's what you're after. The crazy thing about rare video games is that obviously no one at the time can tell if a game is going to become this incredibly sought after piece of code. And even with hindsight, there are not a ton of similarities between one rare game and the next, other than there not being many of them. Which begs a far more important question: why are some games released with so few copies? It's not like they're rare drops from loot boxes and gacha games where you manufacture a disingenuous sense of scarcity to drive people to spend more money in pursuit of their favorite waifus, because selling games is generally something you want to make as easy as possible. You spend money developing a game, produce a ton of copies, and then see how much money you can make back. Hopefully it's not like E.T. and you just fill a land site full of most of them. But that's the great thing about the pre-video game crash 1980. Shit was happening so fast that barely anyone could keep up, and that's part of the reason why everything fell apart in the end. In 1982, developer Men of Vision released their only game, some kind of weird variant of Space Invaders called Air Raid, complete with this odd handle design to the cartridge. This is one of the rarest games of all time, and there's barely half a dozen copies out there. Explaining why is the hard part here, because Men of Vision isn't really a company with a lot of backstory behind it. The Wikipedia page for Air Raid doesn't have anything to say about the developers, and further searches online reveal very small tidbits of info like an old address for the company that was printed in the manual to Air Raid that pinpoints the location to Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. So that's really helpful, that's narrowed it down so much. At a time when Atari weren't doing a ton of regulating of what kind of games ended up on their 2600, it's entirely possible that the 1980s equivalent of indie developers squeezed their rudimentary shoot-'em-up onto one of the most important consoles of all time. There's also the added subplot where naysayers claim that Air Raid was a hoax made by someone after the 1980s to scam collectors out of their money by claiming that this cartridge was worth tens of thousands of dollars. It seems unlikely though, considering that multiple copies have been found and sold, but it really does add to the whole sense of intrigue and mystery surrounding this game and many other rare games out there. Maybe that's what you're paying so much money for here, a claim to a piece of gaming history that we may never know everything about. I'd say you can't put a price on that, but apparently you can. I did think that making a video about rare games is a little one-dimensional. It would be very easy and yet very boring for me to list a bunch of valuable games that don't exist in any great number across the world that were once sold for stupid amounts of money, but why the fuck would I do that? The more interesting angle is the why, and the stories behind a game that clearly had no intention of being limited edition, but ended up there all the same. Especially with the 1980s Atari period, there's a beautiful, honest naivety about some of the tales of individuals taking it upon themselves to create a video game and yet not really knowing how to get the word out. In 1984, Anthony Takar decided to make a video game because he was such a big fan of what Atari were doing, or had done, before the industry imploded, and so taught himself how to program on the 2600's hardware and eventually made Birthday Mania, a simplistic shooter game where you put out candles with lasers. And it's one of the rarest games of the lot. for reasons that are actually easier to explain than most other games I've talked about already. Releasing a game in 1984 was already not the best idea in the world because the gaming industry was a pile of smouldering ashes at this point, and no one really cared enough to help promote it much beyond the ad that Takar put in a newspaper. The story goes that Takar would handle the distribution of Birthday Mania on a case-by-case basis, and personalize each copy with a happy birthday message on the title screen, which is goddamn adorable and I love it. I was lucky enough to get one of these for myself, and of course I was only ever gonna get a message about how, if you're enjoying this video and want to see more, then feel free to subscribe and click that bell to receive notifications of every new upload. This all meant that barely a dozen copies of this game were ever sold, with that number likely being even lower than that because not many of those have resurfaced online since then, and when they have, it's been for oodles of money. If you want to be inspired to make a game, then one man's journey to create something this valuable might just be what does it for you. Although, then you need the market to crash, but I suppose there's always a chance of that happening. So there's a little feature that I haven't really touched on with this topic, and that's the true nature of a game being rare. We only know about these scarcely distributed video games because they've been sold online for megabucks, which acts as both a way of determining its approximate value, or at least how much a collector is willing to pay for it, and also how uncommon it is. There could well be a game out there that remains hidden away in a box without anyone knowing its true value, or one that a collector refuses to part with. It's very difficult to ascertain how genuinely rare a game is, but if you're dealing with the only copy of a 36-year-old game, then I don't need to tell you a damn thing. Surprise, surprise, we're back to the Atari 2600, and instead of a 1984 release in the empty void of the video game crash, Gamma Attack came out 1 year prior just as shit was being flung at fan with exciting new revolutionary ways of playing Atari games, or at least this one Atari game. Gamation? Ooh. The company behind it were making a joystick adapter called the Firepower 100 that would function a lot like a turbo button does on a more modern hardware, and add rapid fire functionality to the Atari's joystick. To help sweeten the deal, Gamation got to work on Gamma Attack so that the FP100 would have some software that complemented it, and considering it's yet another shooter, it certainly does that. However, these were famously tricky times for gaming, and with very little advertisement for the game alongside a general feeling of unrest and unwillingness to spend any money on video games, Gamma Attack was not produced in any great quantities. In fact, depending on what website you go on and who you ask, some say there exists just one authentic copy of Gamma Attack in the world. Sure, there's been reproductions and tons of fakes circulated in an effort to potentially ride off this game's fame and turn a tasty profit, but supposedly the sole copy is owned by Anthony Donardo, who tried to sell it in 2008 for $500,000. Considering that it's the sole survivor of a fascinating pocket of Atari's legacy, I can sort of understand the asking price, but also someone should tell Tony that Gamation reformed in 2008 and made Gamma Attack available for PC alongside a host of other homebrew Atari games. That is one expensive paperweight. This has been RabbidLuigi, and I see the story of Gamma Attack as an indication of how valuable games can realistically become. It's all well and good having the last copy of an obscure game that many didn't even think existed until recently, but the fact that it didn't sell for $500,000 shows that the people out there who know its value weren't interested in parting with the money. You know, it can have all the backstory in the world, but it's only worth as much as someone is willing to pay for it. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.